Hello, Chris.
Hello, George.
Yep. Do you want me to hit the share screen, or are you ready?
Just let's go ahead and get started here, and I'll walk people through the process for the Q&A time. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Transitioning to Normalcy. My name is Chris Fretz, and I am the Program Coordinator at the Parish Resource Center, and we are grateful to have George Giangi with us this morning. He is the Chairman for Business, Industry, and Infrastructure at the South Central Pennsylvania Task Force. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Parish Resource Center, we're a nonprofit based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that serves churches and nonprofit organizations throughout central Pennsylvania and down into Maryland. And we offer webinars, workshops, events. We have a library of books and Sunday school curriculum, vacation Bible school curriculum, and other resources for churches. And we also do administrative services for churches and nonprofits, such as bookkeeping and website design and redesign. So if you're not familiar with us, feel free to check out our website, and we'd be delighted to talk to you more about some of the services and resources we offer. We will be doing a series of workshops about some of the aspects of life that need addressed in this transition time. And so on Tuesday, May 12 at 10 a.m., we'll have another webinar in our series on transitioning to normalcy entitled Caring for Mental Health. And that will be facilitated by Leslie Huff. She's a licensed psychologist with the Samaritan Counseling Center, and she will teach coping skills that can be used in daily life to care for the mental health of ourselves and our loved ones. You can register for our webinars by going to parishresourcecenter.org and clicking on events and workshops. For our webinar this morning, George will be presenting some content, and then we'll have some time for an interactive Q&A sharing time. And currently all of your microphones are muted. And so when we get to the question and answer time, we will ask you to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. And so in order to do that, you will want to go to where it says participants at the bottom of your screen and click on that. And then that should bring up a list of all the participants in the Zoom call. And then as you can see down in the right corner, the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you can raise your hand. And then we will be able to see that you have raised your hand, and I will call on you and unmute your microphone so that you can then share your question or your sharing. All right. Well, George, I think we are ready for you to take it away. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Make sure we got this. Okay, I'm just trying to get in a full screen here, guys. Be patient. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me okay? I am so glad to be here this morning in the flip-flop and pajama days of webinar training. I hope this webinar finds you in good health and in reasonably good condition based on where we are today. I guess that's a tall order. What I hope to talk about today is the next phase. We've all seen what it's been like over the last couple of months or so. Most of us have been in isolation, doing a lot of social distancing, teleworking. So where do we go in this next phase, and how do we, as a house of worship, kind of prepare for that next phase, taking and keeping in mind that we want to obviously provide for the protection of our clergy, volunteers, and congregants. So my name is George Giangi. As Chris mentioned, I'm with the South Central Pennsylvania Task Force. For those of you that are not familiar with the task force concept, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is divided into 9 task forces, regional task forces. I'm in the South Central PA Task Force, which consists of 9 counties in the South Central Pennsylvania region. We get our funding through the Department of Homeland Security, and there are a number of standing subcommittees, including firefighters, police, hospital, healthcare, agriculture, and mine, which is business and industry. We've also expanded the business and industry a few years ago to include houses of worship, faith-based organizations. A number of you may already be part of my virtual membership. At the very end of this presentation will be my email address. For those of you who would like to enroll on my email distribution, please feel free to reach out to me. Chris, through the Parish Resource Center, will be providing you copies of my slides. So you don't need to take too detailed notes, but at least recognize that you'll be receiving these slides. This will also be recorded. If you want to let your folks know that they may come back at their own leisure and kind of view this recording at their own convenience, that would be good too. So what I hope to talk about today is what we know already about the coronavirus, where we go in the next step, and more importantly, towards the end of the webinar, I'm leaving enough time, a good 20 or 30 minutes at least, to have some interactive discussion and Q&A. I certainly don't know all your religious denominations. I'm not familiar with the traditions that you certainly are, the rituals. So each denomination is just a little different. And so I'm looking to learn from you as much, hopefully, as you'll get out of today's webinar from me in terms of what you're planning to do. What best practices are you considering? What challenges, what hardship do you face? And hopefully we all can profit from that information going forward. So just to put this in perspective, the seasonal flu, normal seasonal flu, we'll get anywhere from 12,000 to 60,000 Americans will die every year. I think on average about 30 to 40,000 is more along the lines of what we would see in a seasonal flu. Back about 10 years ago in the swine flu, the H1N1 flu pandemic, approximately 12,000 Americans died. Over 100 years ago in the Spanish flu, 675,000 Americans died. Over 50 to 60 million, it's often sometimes as high as 70, 80 million worldwide died from the Spanish flu. So far in the coronavirus, as of this morning, we have about 66,000 Americans that have perished due to the virus. So some of the challenges that we face with the coronavirus is obviously the vaccines are not yet available. People can be carrying the virus and can be asymptomatic or not showing any signs of symptoms for maybe as long as a 2-week period, but still have the possibility of infecting others. And the characteristic of this virus, unfortunately, is that it's easily transmissible from human to human. The lifespan of the virus on solid surfaces can be as many as 2 to 5 days, depending on the material. Less porous material, less survivability. And there's always a possibility of the virus mutating. So where do we go from here? It's anticipated that we'll go through probably the next 4 phases. We are currently in phase 1, which as we all are familiar with, our life-sustaining businesses are to remain open, and everyone else is to be isolated or sheltered. The phase that we're going to go in is basically a limited reopening, state by state. They all have their different uh, characteristics and rules that we're criteria, if you will, that as we get from one phase to another, we have to meet certain criteria, and in so doing, we can relax some of these measures that we've been accustomed to over the last couple of months. And another phase, the next phase would be mass vaccination. Once a vaccine is developed and it's distributed, and then finally reopening all the states without any restrictions whatsoever. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to those days. So risk exposures to your house of worship personnel, you ought to go back and kind of consider what workers, what personnel in your denomination, in your house of worship, might be exposed to a higher level risk than perhaps others. So, for example, the housekeeping staff, maintenance staff, maybe the teachers, because they're dealing with children who tend to carry the virus, but not necessarily show any signs of symptoms or are drastically affected by the virus. And of course, at the low end of that spectrum is personnel that have little or no interface at all with the public. You should obviously provide the protective measures appropriate for that level of risk. So if somebody is in the process of housekeeping and cleaning potentially infected areas, it's appropriate to give them face masks, gloves, and that sort of thing, since they have the potential of being in contact with a virus. Routine cleaning. Now, this is from in between one service to another. There's no suspicion of a virus or of an infection. Routinely, just clean all high-touch common surface areas. What does that consist of? This is not all exhaustive, but certainly the sanctuaries, the pews, counters, tabletops, doorknobs, light switches, everything that is likely to come in contact with personnel. Things that you might ordinarily clean maybe once a week, once a month, you might want to do it a lot more frequently than that. And obviously ritual items, ritual clothing that your religious leadership come in contact with routinely, disinfect them or clean them routinely. You should use a disinfectant with a label that says it's EPA approved. Most disinfectants essentially have those characteristics. You could make your own disinfectant with a 2% bleach solution. Typically, that's a third of a cup of bleach to a gallon of water, or a tablespoon of bleach to a quart of water. So any of those will certainly render the virus inactive. Now, cleaning an infected area is a bit more exhaustive than what we just went through. If you suspect an area to have been contaminated with someone that was known to have the coronavirus, ideally you want to close off the area to entering personnel, vent it thoroughly, open the windows, open the doors, let the outside air come in, deep clean the area with normal soap solution, followed by a disinfection with an EPA approved disinfectant. And again, depending on the disinfectant that you use, you may have to leave it on the surface for at least 5 minutes, sometimes as long as 10 minutes. I'll give you an example. Hydrogen peroxide will only take as little as a minute to disinfect or kill the virus. The site that I have, the link at the bottom, is a good site to kind of visit for specific cleaning and disinfecting some of these workspaces. And again, these slides will be sent to you after this webinar. So some HVAC considerations. I know that's an area that is typically not considered, but as we are approaching the milder weather, especially in the Northeast area, during milder weather, you want to increase outdoor air ventilation for buildings. So open up your doors and windows, get as much outside air as you can so you don't get a lot of stagnant air with potential contaminants in the form of viruses and certainly bacteria, molds, and that sort of thing. So here's some examples you might want to consider. Maybe running the HVAC fans on 24/7. As you may or may not know, there's two settings typically for your thermostat. For your fans to be on all the time, 24/7, and there's an auto setting. The auto setting will only allow the fan to energize once it calls for heating or air conditioning. So it's not running as much. So obviously you're not cleaning the air as frequently as if you had it on the on position where it would run 24/7. You might want to consider higher filter ratings in your HVAC system. Typically, those are the pleated ratings. They may have indications on the label that it's good for molds and bacteria and that sort of thing, in addition to just particulates. You might also want to consider a HEPA portable air cleaner, which will again supplement your filtration in your HVAC system. Some organizations can and have used ultraviolet light as a germicidal cleaning system as part of your ductwork. You can buy them in as standalone systems, or you can incorporate them in your duct. The ultraviolet light itself will damage a genetic material of these microorganisms, to include bacteria, molds, and viruses. And they're relatively inexpensive. So you want to seek advice from various experts, subject matter experts. Legal, certainly, for litigation protection. I know that's a big concern lately as we approach the next phase. Are companies and organizations going to be somewhat liable if somebody contracts the virus while they come into one of your services, for example? Your religious hierarchy, I hope by now, has issued, if not, seek them out for some guidance on the practices that is specific to your own denomination. Medical, the use of masks, the vaccine shots, medical screening. We'll talk a little bit about that in some future slides. Your insurance carriers, is your coverage sufficient from a liability standpoint? HVAC, as we mentioned, how is the air quality and the air exchange for your facility? Can you do something to improve upon that or increase it? Again, the more air exchange, the less likely that somebody will contract the virus. And bear in mind that the virus itself isn't what's being transmitted. It's being transmitted in the mode of a sneeze or a cough, or loud, close talking, that sort of thing. So it's really that we're trying to control, that transmissibility of the virus, and that's why some of these considerations are important to take into account. And certainly take hold of the latest guidance. This is such a fluid event that it really changes almost on a daily basis as far as what we learn about the characteristics of this virus. So seek the latest guidance from the federal, state, and local health departments. Certainly CDC has been on top of this as well by giving you as much information as they have on the virus. And pandemic education, I like to make sure that good, proper hygiene techniques is emphasized among your staff, your volunteers, and your congregation. Reinforce some of these techniques periodically, especially as we just enter into phase 2 and phase 3. Keep in mind that, hey, here's what you want to take into account. Maybe put them in the bulletins, maybe, at the beginning of each service, kind of just remind personnel about good, proper hygiene. Provide a pandemic information link on your website to keep all your stakeholders informed. Especially since we're really limiting face-to-face interactions. This is one good way of at least maintaining a connection with your congregation. So looking ahead, it really is anybody's crystal ball, but some medical experts warn of a potential of the return of the COVID-19 in the next 1 or 2 years. Can the virus mutate, as we mentioned, and take on different characteristics? Can we go from phase 1 to phase 2 and then, God forbid, go back to phase 1? It's anyone's guess. And it really comes down to a balancing act between the nation's health versus the nation's economy. And we're seeing a lot of protests throughout the country with people just eager to start back into a normal lifestyle again. You know, they're taking exception with some of the governor's extreme orders, and you know, so what lies ahead is anyone's guess. We're all intimately familiar with the concept of social distancing and teleworking. I'm going to get into this in just a little bit more detail. So, live streaming services. If you have incorporated live streaming in your religious beliefs or in denomination, you might want to indicate in the chat box. I'd be curious to see whether you've done that, or are you just essentially because we're not having full service, face-to-face service, haven't done anything in the last 6 to 8 weeks. Does your house of worship have the skill sets and the equipment to live stream? Do your congregation members have the capability to view live stream? Some of them may not be tech savvy. Have they been left out as a result of their lack of skill or knowledge to kind of access YouTubes and Zoom and other social media platform? Are you teleworking securely? This recent website in this link, cisa.gov/telework, is a really great website to visit. It's been updated as recently as the last day or two to kind of give you some good cyber hygiene techniques to ensure your security and safety as we telework through these days. So you want to try and maximize the technology for some of your activities. Seek out assistance for live streaming if you don't possess the skill sets or the equipment. For example, the Parish Resource Center, I'm told, have a number of people who are familiar with this process, and they may be willing to guide your organization and help them through to make sure that you're totally taking advantage of technology to maintain that connection with your congregation. Maybe you want to offer your parishioners assistance with live streaming. If you're not familiar with it, you know, maybe hold a Zoom conference or provide some information in the form of an email. Here's how you walk yourself through joining a Zoom conference or getting on YouTube to follow a live streaming service. Your religious leadership might want to consider employing technology for such things as marital counseling, for meetings that you routinely hold throughout the normal year, but because of the coronavirus, just have not been able to do it in a face-to-face manner. Obviously, you want to choose technology over face-to-face gatherings, especially as we get into this next few months. You want to try to limit gatherings to less than 10 people, and needless to say, try and maintain social distancing of at least 6 feet. So with any other type of a disaster, you know, there are some opportunities for some criminal activities or some harassment. We have seen a 600% increase in phishing email attacks in the first quarter alone that are COVID-19 related, unfortunately. The public has an insatiable appetite for anything that is coronavirus or COVID-19 related. So phishing scams, which may have in the subject line something like COVID-19 or stimulus checks, are certainly enticing people to open that email, click on a link, hoping to learn more about the topic. In so doing, they may introduce malware to their system and result in all kinds of mayhem to their computers. Social engineering, you know, it may be an email posing as a charity. There's non-delivery scams. Hey, you pay us 100% for your masks, and you find out that you never ever get any delivery of the product, and you don't really know who it was that you communicated with. Miracle cure scams or snake oil salesmen, impersonation scams, and lately with the high usage of Zoom platforms, there's video teleconferencing hijacking, where you find yourself on a conference and all of a sudden somebody hacks in and you know, puts a swastika on there or some vulgar language, excuse me, or even porn, So you might want to take all the precautions as we get into more and more usage of teleconferencing. So there is some financial assistance available for nonprofits. The houses of worship have been hit especially hard during the state lockdowns. You know, we're not seeing the congregation coming in. The offerings are at a you know, obviously are taking its toll. The CARES Act that the federal government has implemented includes nonprofits, and it provides for an opportunity to obtain a loan 2.5 times the average of your monthly payroll, or $10 million, whichever is less. And if the loan is used to cover such things as payroll costs and employee salaries and rent payments and utilities and that sort of thing, the loan will be forgiven. The loan, however, forgiveness will be reduced if you end up laying people off or reducing their wages. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, but with the tax law changes, the charitable contributions now are not as much as they used to be a few years ago because of the standard deduction increasing significantly. Under the CARES Act, the charitable contributions up to $300 can still be deducted above and beyond the standard reduction or standard deduction on the individual's annual tax returns. So that's kind of a good incentive as well. And of course, there's the economic injury disaster loan, which is also inclusive of nonprofits, the 501c3 organizations that have been adversely affected by the coronavirus. Up to $10,000 can be loaned, and it does not have to be paid back. So staying in touch with your stakeholders is so important, I think, especially since the last 6 to 8 weeks, we've lost that connection. Whatever platform you choose, whether it's social media, phone calls, Zoom, Skyping, whatever it happens to be, even emails, maintaining that connection, I think, is important as we go back to normalcy. So you want to identify and connect and assist with your vulnerable and isolated parishioners. You want to try and provide the needed psychological and spiritual support during times of isolation. We're all experiencing some form of depression. It's been a rough 6 to 8 weeks, and obviously, I think you probably know better than anyone else who in your congregation are probably looking for someone to reach out to them and kind of guide them through some of these times. Whether even if it's a family members or members of your congregation, just recognize that it's not easy, especially the elderly. People in the nursing homes especially have been hit pretty hard. You know, they've been without any direct contact with family members except for potentially a phone call or so. So on a positive note, you know, the collaboration between the private and public sectors has never been any stronger since perhaps World War II. The country is taking aggressive steps, very aggressive steps, to limit the spread of COVID-19. And the medical community is certainly far more advanced than any previous pandemics. The virus vaccine development and testing is really on a fast track. It's probably not fast enough that you know, that we'd be comfortable with, but typically 18 to 24 months is what we would expect for vaccine development. It's looking more like potentially 9 to 12 months. There is some really good hope for some therapeutic drugs that are on the horizon and finding its way into helping people that have been infected. And here are some websites that you might want to consider connecting with. And my email address is at the bottom. Again, if you want situational awareness updates or perhaps announcements about future house of worship activities such as conferences, training sessions, or even latest information from the intelligence community on what to look for with scams and criminal activities and that sort of thing. I only ask that you do not send out some of these emails that I send out to you to the media or to the general public. Anyone else that you think has a need to know is certainly fine to forward it to. So we're nearing the second half of the webinar, and I kind of want to look at the mindset of how do we really transition to normalcy. I suggest that it really should be a crawl, walk, run process. The parishioners will rightfully be cautious, so it's up to you to let them know that you are taking their safety seriously, and that you're trying to do all that you can to provide for their safety as you provide for their spiritual needs. So what does that consist of? Well, lessons learned. What did we learn over the last 2 months or 3 months or so? What would you have done differently if we found ourselves in the next pandemic, maybe down the road 3, 4, 5 months? Over the summer, you might want to stock up on some personal protective equipment, such as gloves, masks, sanitizers, disinfectants. We all know the worst time to buy milk and bread is the Friday before an impending snowstorm. So you might want to consider going out while we have a somewhat of a lull. Is your technology adequate? What would it need to kind of upgrade some of that technology? So if you find yourself in this situation again, do you need a more newer operating system, for example, or newer computer? Maybe you might want to grab somebody from your congregation who is tech savvy. That's typically defined as someone less than 14 years old. So you might want to reach out to some of these people and kind of get yourself prepared for that next phase. Emphasize good hygiene practices. I think, maybe the new normal is that in the future, we'll do away with certain things that we've always taken for granted. And you might want, if you don't have a formal pandemic plan, develop one or certainly improve upon it based on some of these lessons learned. So for the next phase, consider some of these people issues. Someone in the congregation is sneezing or coughing at a service. What if someone violates the social distance rules? What actions should you take? What would you, as leadership of your denomination, of your house of worship, should you get involved? Is that something that, how do you approach it? It's such a sensitive matter. If a vaccine is developed, should all members of your congregation be required to get a vaccine or else wear a mask in order to enter the facility, in order to come into your service? Again, these are not easy things to wrestle with, but I would rather you think about some of these considerations today rather than do it on an ad hoc basis and have to deal with it. What do we do now? This is happening. Somebody is sneezing at a service. Congregants are complaining to the religious leadership. Do you approach that person and say, hey, look, if you're going to sneeze, can you please cover your mouth or use a tissue or please step out, or, those kinds of things is something to consider. These are real world examples of what you might be faced with. Your religious hierarchy guidance, obviously, if they've issued something like that, take advantage of it. Seek them out for some guidance and some advice. What do you recommend we do? We normally can do this practice in our religion. Should we continue to doing it? So some sample congregation protective measures, and these are just as the slide suggests, they're just examples. I am not familiar with your religious traditions, so I am now at the point where I'm hoping we all can chime in, but perhaps you want to screen parishioners upon entering, scan them for a fever or for symptoms, ask all parishioners to wear masks, at least initially, space them 6 feet apart. Should you increase the number of services, recognizing that if they're going to be placed 6 feet apart, you don't have room for everybody that normally would show up at the 10:30 service, for example. How about even considering holding services just for the elderly or for the vulnerable population, so that they feel a little bit more comfortable that they're not going to be interacting with somebody that may be carrying, but maybe the elderly and the vulnerable population have been self-isolating, and so they're less likely to transmit the virus. Again, these are just examples to plant the seeds in your minds for what you might want to consider doing. Maybe reserve a section of your house of worship for the vulnerable population, as I'm sure you probably do already for the mobility impaired. Doing away with non-essential contact religious practices. So by that, I mean things that traditions that typically require hands-on type of thing. Maybe the holy water receptacles, the votive candles, shaking of hands, doing away with those types of traditions, at least initially. Continuing along those lines, stop passing the offering baskets. Maybe have it with the stretch pole so that not every congregant is touching the basket. Safely conduct those essential contact religious practices. And that's where it gets a little tougher. So for example, I'm from the Catholic religion. What would the Catholic religion do to perform communion, for example, passing of the host? Placing no-touch hand sanitizers throughout the facility, that's a given. Visibly display disinfection before and after each service. Let your congregation see firsthand you're taking their safety seriously. You know, you're really going above and beyond to provide for their safety. Ensuring that the housekeeping staff are adequately protected, as we mentioned. And that's really kind of it in the for the webinar. Again, we've got roughly 25 minutes or so, and I'm looking for you to kind of, in addition to any questions that you might have, if you want to offer up what you consider might be best practices in going from this phase to the next phase, I certainly would be interested, as I'm sure most of the attendees would be interested in some of your thoughts. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you to kind of moderate the questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And if you have comments that you want to suggest, by all means, let Chris know and we can share them with the attendees.
George, we do have one question that was chatted in that said, do you anticipate restrictions on large group meetings to be modified or lifted before a vaccine is developed?
I think personally, I certainly do think that will be the case. I think as we enter the next phase, you want to limit social gatherings. You want to try and isolate and practice social distancing as much as you can. And we're talking at least the next 2-3 months, if not longer. So certainly I think if it's not ordered per se by the governor, I think it's going to be suggested guidance by the health community.
All right. We also have some things that people are sharing through the chat. One is instead of passing the offering plates, they will put them at the entrances and remind people to place their offerings there. Another is printing all music in the bulletin, eliminating the need to handle hymnals or other music books.
Yeah, by the way, Chris, some organizations, if you have the capability of even projecting with a PowerPoint, for example, the words of the hymns up on a wall or on a screen, that would even be less likely for transmission of the virus. So yeah, those are great suggestions.
Yeah. We have a number of questions coming in through the chat, but I will also be unmuting the folks who have their hands raised so that they can also participate and ask their question or share. Ava ODM, you
No,
are
I didn't.
now
That got pressed by mistake.
Okay.
Okay, go on.
And Chris, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the Parish Resource Center does have the capability of assisting some of the organizations in live streaming and technology challenging issues. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're happy to hear what your needs are and talk through what your congregation's needs are and see if live streaming makes sense for you, if it makes sense to record your service and share it with people that way. There are a lot of options, and we'd love to be able to consult with you and help you figure that out.
And also, as well as good cyber hygiene and teleconferencing hygiene to minimize your exposure to opportunistic, criminal types of activities.
Yes, absolutely. As we've been doing these webinars, we've needed to think through measures that reduce the risk of Zoom bombing. And so we're happy to talk through those with you as well. You can always email us at info@parishresourcecenter.org, and we'd be glad to set up a time to talk with you.
Again, if I can just emphasize again, if you see anything that's coronavirus related from an untrusted source in an email, really scrutinize that email before you open it and click on a link. Look for misspellings, look for obvious signs that just don't appear to be right. If you have a feeling in your gut that there's something a little suspicious about the email, just go ahead and delete it rather than taking the chance that it may be a spam or phishing email.
Thank you, George. Beth, you are unmuted. You may go ahead and share.
Okay, thank you. George, I have a couple of questions that I hope you can give me some guidance on. I serve a church which is over 150 years old in Lancaster City. So our church has a wooden chancel rail and wooden pews. So I'm just wondering what Clorox and any kind of disinfectant will do to the furniture that we have. If we spray it on and just let it stay, does that do anything to the wood, or are we okay doing that? Do you know?
Typically, it should not harm it. I mean, I would recommend you try it on an area that is not visible, just to make sure. Typically, those have a good polyurethane or varnish, so typically it should not harm it. But again, every disinfectant has its own characteristics. I would recommend you do an inconspicuous area just to test it and make sure. But and again,
Okay.
leaving it on for a little bit of time. Don't just some people just think that you just spray it and wipe it off is good enough. Let it have enough time to deactivate the nucleus of the microorganism sufficiently before you go ahead and wipe it off.
Okay. Okay. Another question I have is, we are not air conditioned. We have heat, obviously, but we are not air conditioned. We have high ceilings because we have a balcony, and there are fans in the ceilings. You recommend that we keep our doors open and the fans on, or how
is your heating system a passive, a radiant versus forced air?
we have a boiler. I don't know what that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, if you have a forced air system, the filtration system running it on 24/7, or at least certainly throughout the entire service, would be better. And again, if we get into colder weather, opening the doors and windows is kind of counterproductive. So if you can ventilate, that would be great. Running the fans would also assist. It's an improvement. It's not going to give you 100% guarantee, but nothing is. I mean, we're doing all that we can to reasonably reduce the probability of exposure.
Right. And just one more question, if I could. You talked about not using hymnals and printing the music and everything in the bulletin. We do have a weekly bulletin, but we also use a service booklet for the church season of the year, whatever season we happen to be in. Is it recommend, and those are made out of obviously paper and heavy cardstock. Is it recommended not to use those, or is it okay to use paper? I don't know how long it lives on paper.
Yeah, it's less the less porous the material, the less life of the virus. So, for example, plastics and glass and that sort of thing, it could survive for days, 2, 3, 4 days.
Okay.
On cardboard, it may be like 12 to 24 hours. So, you know, that's kind of the rule. Ideally, if you can do away with not having to use something that is contacted by a number of congregants, that would be preferred. And again, I don't know if you can rely on technology, maybe a screen or a flat screen, or you know, and run some of the words up on the screen. Ideally, um, you know, there's no other way around it. It's going to be difficult to go back and disinfect every hymnal in between each
Right.
service to do so in an effective manner.
Okay, well, we only have one service. We're a very small congregation.
Gotcha. Yep.
And I would say 7/8 of our congregation, including the pastor, which is me, is in the vulnerable population. So
Sure.
that's,
You know,
that's
another idea, Pat, might be for the congregants to wear gloves.
okay.
Disposable gloves.
Okay.
Yep.
We could, yeah, I thought about that. We could do that. Yeah, we could hand those out with the bulletin.
Yeah, these are strange times.
Thank you, Beth. James, you are unmuted.
All right, thank you. George, our church applied for and was accepted to get one of the care loans. However, the rules are starting to, I think, change a little bit about forgiveness. And depending on if you have an endowment and how much it is and how it's structured, that may affect the forgiveness of the loan. Do you have any information that you could share regarding that?
I do not, unfortunately. I know things have changed because of the first few phases. I think they ran out of some of the money, and we've been hearing things like, you know, the Ruth Chris's and Harvard and those sort of things with large endowments, and they've been basically shamed into giving back some of the money. So I am not up to speed on the most recent rules. I would recommend you contact or just do a search on the Federal CARES Act for the nuances.
Yeah, we have a CPA in our congregation who's on top of it. But again, I think it depends on how your endowment is structured and how you can tap into it for your general funds. And I asked this question as well for those other churches that have applied for and gotten those loans, to be sure to look into, you know, that part of the forgiveness.
Yep, that's a good point. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome.
Okay, Nick, you are unmuted. You may go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. And I want to point out that George and y'all did a great job with this webinar and last week with the security webinar. I appreciate it. I'm former law enforcement and retired, and that's operative. I'm not a law enforcement officer anymore. I want to point out one thing that I am kind of struggling with here, and that is the enforcement aspect when we actually start to allow people to come back to church under certain restrictions. It's been pointed out to me that certain people in, you know, the Catholic diocese want to be as cautious about this as possible, and I agree with that. And I love this crawl, walk, and you know, you run. We have a moderately sized parish, and I think I'm going to be a stickler to say that when we do return, we have to do so with quite a bit of restrictions as to how many people can attend the service or mass at one time. They're looking at perhaps doing weekday masses first. And I'm thinking that perhaps, you know, public information has to be put out there like you suggested. This has got to take a little time to gear up to, and people need to cooperate. And they're only going to cooperate based on the information they're given. So I've been in grocery stores. I see how most people conform, and I see how some people are adamant not to conform. What I would suggest, and I'm going to be very staunch with this, is that we try to set up a predetermined amount of people that are going to attend, at least at the very get-go. How do you all feel about that? That's what I'm kind of trying to get some more information on, maybe how different denominations might be proceeding with that.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with that. And I also want to thank you for your years of law enforcement service. Uh, Certainly, I think limiting the number of people is going to play right into the hands of social distancing. And that's why one of the suggestions might be to potentially hold more services because you're just not going to be able to fit everybody in. Or you might want to do a combination of Zoom or YouTube services in addition to gatherings with 25, 30%, 40% of your normal attendance rates. So I agree with you. You know that's probably the right way to address it. I also agree that we're going to see different personalities coming out, especially in the last 2 months or so. People are at their wits' end. Maybe tensions might be a little high, temper may be flaring. So you have to kind of pay attention to that as an usher, for example. Try to take that into consideration, and let's not be overly aggressive in that action. Take that into account and try to understand that it's going to take some time to get into some transition of normalcy. But I agree. I think limiting the attendance. Someone should be at the entrance doing a head count, making sure. Obviously, if a family's been self-isolating for the last 6 weeks or 4 weeks or so, they can sit together, and so you allow for that provision. If they are not self-isolating in a certain household, then try to space them 6 feet apart. So all of that kind of goes into I think as we go from one phase to the other.
George, one question that came in through the chat is, do you see a necessity to have houses of worship professionally cleaned before reopening?
I mean, only if you suspect that it has been contaminated with a positive coronavirus person, you can do so. I mean, they have a number of organizations, Service First, Paul Davis, a number of them come to mind. They can actually come in. They have fogging machines that use hydrogen peroxide technology, UV lighting, that sort of thing. So I personally don't think that would be needed unless you suspect or know definitively that area has been exposed to a positive case of coronavirus. Otherwise, I think your own housekeeping staff can do so. And in between services, and that may be the other thing too. Typically maybe you have a 9 o'clock and a 10:30 service. Now to allow for that housekeeping or cleaning and disinfecting, you might want to change the time to allow more time to go in there and do the disinfection in between services. So that's something that you may have to take into consideration as well. But otherwise, I think they can do it on their own without professional, because there's a cost involved in that. Unless you can get a company to do it pro bono, which might be a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, George. We are getting a number of questions and observations coming in through the chat, and I'm not sure that we'll have time to share all of them here, but one thing that has come up repeatedly is people are expressing caution and asking questions about choirs and how to, whether or not to have a choir be back together once we're doing in-person services, and how that might work. George, do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, it's really up to the imagination. Obviously, it warrants cleaning the instruments, disinfecting the instruments routinely, maybe spacing them apart. Could it be recorded and then played back that way during a service? There's probably a number of things you can do, but the closer we can get to normalcy and as quickly as we can do so, I think it's going to be better for everybody. So you just have to use some good common sense and try to do it without unnecessarily exposing people to potential infection.
There were some hands raised, and I'm not seeing any right now, but if anyone would like to, oh, there we go. Bob, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Do you anticipate that retirement communities such as Willow Valley and Moravian Manor will, in the fall, when things begin to open up, place limits on the ability of their residents to go to churches and other places of congregation?
Yeah, I certainly hope so, Bob. I mean, that just my heart goes out to some of the residents of these retirement communities. Another option might be, for example, to go to the retirement community and hold a service there, spacing them apart. I certainly hope that would be the case. It's devastating for them to be in such a condition for that length of time without being close to the loved one. So, I really do hope that is the case.
All right. Bob, did you have a follow-up question?
No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Okay. One thing that someone shared over the chat is that the EPA has just published a new disinfection flowchart for what to do before reopening. And so we can potentially share that along with the presentation afterwards.
Yeah, and they've also listed a lot of the disinfectant solutions that are EPA certified as well, and it's a pretty exhaustive list. If you get on their website, I think you can easily pull that up.
Another potential way of doing worship services that a number of people have commented on are drive-through or drive-in services. George, would you like to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as we go into the next phase, and I know, for example, there's been talk about, I guess, using drive-through for confessionals, for example, or for counseling, and everything you can do to try and minimize face-to-face interactions and still maintaining social distancing as we approach the next month or two is certainly something to consider. It's recommended. You don't want to expose your clergy, for one, as well as your congregants, to unnecessary exposure if you can find another way of accomplishing the same task without getting within that 6-foot face-to-face range. So again, your traditions better than I certainly do for your own religion. What allows for that avenue versus what doesn't?
George, another question that was chatted in is, what implications exist for churches who assemble before a yellow or green phase?
Can you repeat that, Chris?
Sure. What implications exist for churches who assemble before the yellow or green phase has actually begun?
Okay, now recognize religious organizations are exempt from the governor's orders in Pennsylvania. You can certainly perform some of the activities, but the guidance is such that you're doing so at the peril or the potential risk of infecting people. So you need to do in good faith. You need to exercise good judgment in jumping to doing something that doesn't meet the criteria for the next phase. Is there a liability issue? Certainly that's something to consider. There's also a moral issue, and that is you don't want to expose people unnecessarily. So that's the balancing act that you have to deal with. And as we go into the summer months, for example, where weddings, certainly funerals are also something else to consider. They're still trying to exercise the less than 10 person gathering rule and still maintaining some social distancing by being 6 feet apart. and it's not an easy thing to wrestle with, because that's such a major event, and you still have to deal with the coronavirus at the same time. Makes it even more challenging.
Another question that has come in is, should clergy and church workers, for example, Sunday school teachers, be tested for the virus before they participate?
Ideally, that should be the case. And I'm not sure if we can ramp up the testing to allow for that. In some districts, I think you need a doctor's prescription. And then there's two types of testing. One is whether you've been exposed and possess the antibodies, versus diagnostic. You are infected with the COVID-19 virus, or you are not. So yeah, in a perfect world, if you can, that would be ideal, to test them all before we get into the next phase. That's going to remain open until we see how widespread the testing process is nationally.
A related question to that came in is, there have been some concerns about the availability of masks and gloves and other products that are needed to safely carry out some of these activities. How do churches go about reopening if they are running into problems obtaining those materials?
I know that's been getting a lot better, Chris, as we get into this a little further. The prices of masks have gone down, and the terms and conditions have also gone down. There is a 501c3 foundation known as the Emerald Foundation, or Operation Emerald, out of Lancaster, Oregon Pike. We've been partnering with them lately over the last maybe few weeks or so. The Mennonite Disaster Services also provides for some of these masks. Recognize that the masks that you would need for your applications in a house of worship is just a face cloth mask. It is not a surgical mask or N95 or anything of that sort, because all you're trying to do is to protect people from your droplets getting off onto them. And a face cloth mask like you're wearing right now in grocery stores is all that is needed for you to be at a church service, for example. So at that point, just a regular disposable pair of gloves, and also a face cloth mask, whether you make it yourself or just pick it up from organizations, should be more and more readily available than they were, for example, a month or so ago. But try those organizations as well. Mennonite Disaster Services is one, and the other one is Operation Emerald, or the Emerald Foundation. If you Google both of those, that should get you some contact information for them. And there's no charge, I understand, for getting some of those masks. It's donated.
Thank you very much, George. Well, it looks like we are at our time, and we have many questions that have come in. And George, are you open to folks emailing you afterwards if they have
Sure.
follow-up questions?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. And of course, if you would also like to email the Parish Resource Center, you can email us as well. And we will get out the PDF of George's presentation to you early next week, as well as posting a video of the webinar on our website. So thank you all very much for attending. And thank you, George, very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure.